And welcome to another British Cartographic Society Tea Time Talk. My name is Chris Tributis, Vice President of the British Cartographic Society and Coordinator for the Tea Time Talks, and today's chair. Today we have Simon Ritchie, where he'll be speaking on industrial archaeology hiding in plain sight. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to Simon, where he'll be able to tell us a bit more.
Hello. So about my background is in IT. I should say that from the beginning, and I come at this matter from an IT perspective. But about 5 years ago, I became interested in accurate GPS systems, which are, it turns out, IT systems. In my own time, I've been writing software to support them. But as a side effect of all this, I got interested in the history of the Ordnance Survey and the trig points. And that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. Now, I'm just about to put some references into the chat. I put them in earlier, but I don't think you can see them if you joined since I put them in. Okay, so we got various links to various websites. We got a mention of this book. If I can get it in focus. Rachel Hewitt's Map of a Nation, which is a history of the Ordnance Survey up to the 18th century. Now that's augmented by a report that the Ordnance Survey themselves produced in the 1960s about the last complete retriangulation that they did in the 1960s. Oh, and it's worth saying that that retriangulation started, the anniversary of it starting is tomorrow. So it's 89 years since they started. There's also some TV programs there, BBC programs. If they've been shown recently, you can get them on the iPlayer, and some of them have. And what you find is they show them every few years, and then they appear on the iPlayer for about another year again. So you have to keep your eyes open for those. But they're all relevant and interesting. Now I'm going to start by sharing a picture. This is a picture from the Ordnance Survey report that I mentioned. And the Ordnance Survey report contains all sorts of interesting information, including this extremely detailed description of how a trig point is constructed and what it looks like inside. So if you're interested in this stuff, then yeah, you should download and read that report. It's on Google Books these days. The OS used to publish it, but they seem to have stopped. And when I asked them, they said, "Oh, well, you can download it from Google Books." So that's all official. Now I'm going to stop sharing that and start sharing my presentation. Okay, so why industrial archaeology hiding in plain sight? Well, trig points clearly hide in plain sight, particularly live in the south of England like I do. South of England is fairly flat country, and so because you need line of sight to a trig point for it to be useful, there are lots of them, and you come across them when you're out walking. Why industrial archaeology? Because they're now redundant, and they got replaced by accurate GPS systems, which is what the Ordnance Survey now use to make their maps. So maps have been around, well, forever, as long as people have been around. Early rock art, for instance, many people consider that one of the purposes of it was a map where you could find the game when the game would arrive. And the other thing you find is people who own large tracts of land tend to like having maps of their land. So in the 9th century, Caliph al-Ma'mun commissioned a map of the world because he thought, and probably did, control a huge area of it. And apparently he wanted to know just how much of the world he controlled. So he got his people to make a map. More recently, in the 15th century, Europeans started to make what you would regard these days as maps for navigation purposes. So they produced maps and globes to plan sea voyages and military campaigns. But the measuring equipment was very rudimentary. I mean, it might just be somebody counting their steps. Information about the size of the Earth. The Greeks have done a very good job of calculating the size of the Earth, but Greek mathematics comes to us through Islamic authors. And in the Renaissance, the Europeans got hold of some of this literature, but they misread it, and they completely misunderstood the size of the Earth. So when Christopher Columbus thought he was about to sail to China, the reason he thought that was because he thought the Earth was about half its real size. And he was quite lucky that he sort of bumped into one of the Caribbean islands, because, you know, if the Americans hadn't been there, he probably would have starved to death along with his crew. And at the time, there was a quite plausible theory that the Earth was hollow. I believe that Kepler believed this. But things started to improve, and in the 16th century, an English mathematician and inventor called Leonard Digges invented the theodolite. But in those days, the lens technology was... Oh, he also invented the telescope, although that got forgotten and it was reinvented later by various people. But in those days, lens technology was very primitive. By the 17th century, people were starting to make serious maps. And like I said, if you owned a big tract of land, you were quite interested in having a map of it, or having a map of the county with your house shown on it. So that was the kind of people who bought maps. Because the market wasn't very big, they were very expensive. Now, the various instruments, so this is an astrolabe in the Science Museum. That was a sort of Swiss Army knife of calculation in the medieval period, used for all sorts of purposes, including finding the height of a tree and stuff like that. This is a surveyor's angle measure. So by the 17th century, cannon were getting more accurate, and in order to get the cannonball to where you wanted it to be, people were starting to do land surveying and using devices like this. And 1672, the King of France started a mapping project, and 4 generations of the Cassini family mapped France over 50 years using triangulation. They didn't use theodolites, they used a different instrument, but they used the same principles. So the French were ahead of the British. But in the 1690s, there was a South American colony called the Darien Scheme, and people in Scotland invested in it big time, and it failed, and it pretty much bankrupted Scotland. And that's one of the major reasons why Scotland united with England and Wales in the 1707 Act of Union. They were a lot more prepared to do it because, yeah, basically they were broke. And the British government sent a military man called William Roy to map Scotland. It was quite an unruly place, and they wanted to be able to move troops around. So he went out and he used the technology of the day, which was surveyor's chains and pedometers. A pedometer in those days being a wheel on a stick, and you wheeled it across the landscape and counted how many times it turned, and you could work out how far you traveled. So rather better than counting steps, but not hugely good. Roy was later made a major general. So in the 18th century, this was the great age of scientific measurement. And we need to remember that before this, measuring systems were dreadfully inaccurate. Stuff like wooden rulers with accurate divisions, we take those for granted these days, but it wasn't until the 18th century that people figured out how to make them. Achromatic lenses. So the early lenses, basically they sent different colors in different directions. So the image was very fuzzy. And the other innovation was to put crosshairs on a lens made from spider silk, and that's still what's used to make crosshairs. There's a farm somewhere where they farm spiders to make spider silk to make crosshairs. And so it became possible to produce more accurate theodolites incorporating telescopes. And if you've read the book Longitude, you'll know that accurate clocks were very important for navigation. And all this stuff came about in the 18th century. So, as I said, the French were ahead of the British on mapping, but they had big plans. And one of the times when England and France were getting on quite well, the Cassinis proposed a survey of southern England. And the idea was simply to link to the existing survey of France and to find the relative positions of the Paris and Greenwich observatories. And the long-term end was to produce a long baseline to calculate the size of the Earth, because it still wasn't known awfully accurately. And if you're old enough, you may remember that when I was at school, we were told that the meter was 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole along a meridian passing through the Paris Observatory. And the work that I describe here was part of that long-term project to figure out the size and shape of the Earth. So the British government bought into this idea, and off Roy went, and he started by measuring a 5-mile baseline across Hounslow Heath. It's now all built up, but in those days it was open country. One end of it is now Heathrow Airport. The other end of it is quiet little suburb near Hounslow. And you can go there. And in fact, there's a bus that will take you from one end of the baseline to the other, because it's the bus from Kingston upon Thames to Heathrow, which is quite handy because it's almost impossible to park near Heathrow, except in a Heathrow car park, paying Heathrow Airport prices. Now, Roy's team pretty quickly found problems. They were using wooden rulers, and they warped when they got damp. The surveyor's chains expanded and contracted according to the temperature. So somebody hit on the idea of using the most stable technology of the day, which was glass. And so they had made a few 18-foot long glass tubes, carefully measured, and then they started at one end of the baseline, sighted down the tubes to the other end, laid them out on trestles, and then they took the first tube and moved it to the end of the second tube and carried on that way from one end of the baseline to the other over 5 miles. And this was a huge story in those days. People were really interested in science and really interested in the new science of measurement. Sightseers came from all over to watch, including George III. And the length they come up with was 27.404.7 feet. And later on, the Ordnance Survey remeasured it using modern accurate GPS equipment and found it 3,076.8 feet. So a really, really tiny difference in about 250 years of advancing technology. The work that Roy did was fantastically accurate, although he did make a mistake. Here's my picture of the southeast end of the baseline in a place called Roy Grove, named after William Roy. The little lump of plastic on the top is a piece of my GPS equipment. So having worked out this baseline, they could then start triangulating. And for that, they needed a theodolite. And an instrument maker called Jesse Ramsden designed what he called the Great Theodolite. And it was the most accurate instrument produced so far. Well, in Britain anyway. It turned out to be just about the same accuracy as the instrument that the French had been using. It was accurate to 1 minute of arc. But unfortunately, it took him 3 years to build, and he started building it after Roy had produced his baseline. So the team then sat there waiting while Ramsden laboriously produced this theodolite, promising it will be available next week. So he finally completed it in 1787, and Roy's team started work, triangulating points across the south of England. Now, really, all they were interested in doing is finding the position of the Greenwich Observatory, strictly a telescope in the Greenwich Observatory, in relation to another telescope in the Paris Observatory. So what they wanted to do was triangulate their way down to the coast and then across the channel and link up with the Cassini's maps. So they did that. That took about a year. And then they spent another year calculating the results. Now, I find that interesting because of my background in IT. Back in those days, a computer was a person who sat at a desk and did calculations for you. And I've oversimplified what Roy's team had to do because, of course, on different days, under different conditions, the equipment would behave slightly differently. So what you had to do was take lots and lots of readings over several days and carefully measure the temperature and the pressure and all that stuff. And then you had to run this complicated calculation which the Ordnance Survey now call the conditioning equations. And they spent a year doing that. And as I said, the triangulation was in its day huge. It was an iconic project of the Enlightenment because we were able to measure things much, much more accurately than we'd ever been able to measure them before. And people were really interested. Roy was a household name. So because you're cartographers, I presume that you understand the ideas of triangulation. So you take your 5-mile baseline, you put your theodolite at each end, and you measure out to various positions that you can see. And then you take your theodolite to those positions and you do more measurements and you end up with an ever complicated series of triangles. So they completed the triangulation. They weren't interested in producing a map at the time, although Roy had that in mind. They just wanted to find the relative positions of the two observatories. But pretty soon, France and Britain fell out again, and the south of England was a very obvious place for an invasion. And also, they needed accurate maps for all sorts of other purposes: tithes, taxation, poor law admin. So about a year after Roy died, an organization was established, which became the Ordnance Survey. And it was led by Williams and Mudge. And 1800, the Act of Union with Ireland. So it was then necessary to map the whole of Britain, including Ireland. And in 1801, the first map appeared. That was of Kent, 3 guineas, which was about 20 days' wages for a skilled craftsman. So far beyond the reach of most people. Map of Devon, 6 guineas. Not sure why. Maybe Devon's bigger. And in 1870, the first series was complete, covering the whole of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Something that I found quite surprising is that in order to find heights, they used a technique called spirit leveling, which was still used up until the 1970s, which you may or may not know about. Basically, you take an instrument, maybe a theodolite, maybe just a telescope, and somebody stands a distance away from you downhill with a ruler, and you use a telescope to find out the difference in height between you and where they are. And then you go through a series of steps across the entire country and find the height of various points. And those points are benchmarks, and you find them all over the place. So this is one on the parish church in Leatherhead. That's the right-hand picture. This is one on a pub in Leatherhead, a penny black pub. This is one on the wall of an alleyway. all covered in moss these days. Okay, so what they'd done now is they'd figure out where various things were in relation to other things, but everything was relative. So it was all relative to the various baselines they produced. So what you really like to do is convert that to latitude and longitude, which you did using a telescope. And so that's why knowing the position of the center of a telescope at Greenwich Observatory is a very useful thing, because once you've worked out the longitude and latitude of that, and you've worked out where everything in the country is in relation to that, you can work out the longitude and latitude of everywhere else. So over the 19th century, the work continued. India was surveyed and all the other bits of the empire. And there was constant improvement in surveying equipment, in particular artificial lights, so that they could work at night. Meanwhile, railways and new roads came along, cities expanded, and so there was a continuous remapping effort. And there were new customers, so there was this virtuous circle where maps got cheaper and more customers bought them. And people started to go out on rambles. So the Rambling Association started up. And then more technology came along, aerial photography to augment the theodolite surveys. City dwellers discover country life. Time is short, so I won't go into that in too much detail. But the point I'm making here is back in Shakespeare's time, people thought the countryside was a dangerous place. You know, people who lived in towns were a bit afraid to go out in the country. You could get your throat cut and all sorts of bad things could happen to you. But then in the 19th century, industrialization happened, and all of a sudden, the towns were the place of the dark satanic mills, and the countryside was a green and pleasant land. And all of a sudden, people wanted to go into the countryside. So by the 20th century, the Ordnance Survey decided that they needed a complete resurvey. In the 19th century, because people would insist on interfering with trig points, you know, if you built a little cairn to mark where you'd measured a position precisely, some idiot will come along and knock it down, or it might just get knocked down by sheep. So what they started to do was bury blocks of stone which were not local. So, you know, maybe if it was a sandstone area, you'd bury a block of granite. In a granite area, you'd bury a block of sandstone. Now, these were called freestones. And the records just said, oh, if you talk to Mr. Jones, the farmer, he knows where the stone is. But of course, Mr. Jones by then had died. Meanwhile, the surveying techniques and the equipment had improved. They'd figured out that there was probably an increasing error west to east in height. And there had been serious budget cuts in 1922, which compromised the work. So mapping work that should have been done wasn't done, and great areas had completely changed under people's feet. Meanwhile, new ideas. Universal Transverse Mercator, UTC notation, is basically that's eastings and northings. 1830, the Astronomer Royal had defined the airy spheroid, which was an approximation to the shape of the Earth, chosen to suit cartography on the mainland, on British mainland, and then modified to suit cartography in Ireland. They measured sea level, mean sea level, very precisely. So they took hourly readings of sea level at Newlyn over 6 years to come up with Ordnance Datum Newlyn, ODN. So by 1936, they invented OSGB 36, which incorporated the idea of eastings, northings, height above mean sea level based on ODN, and the airy spheroid to convert from that notation into longitude and latitude and back again. So the retriangulation started 89 years ago tomorrow. and they re-triangulated the whole of Britain using modern theodolites, and they created the trig points. Very, very robust devices, buried at least with foundations that went down at least 2.5 feet into the ground. And there's a website these days that tells you where they all are, and because the Ordnance Survey released the data about them a few years ago, it's now freely downloadable. And some nice person produced a website, so you can find your local trig points and you can find out the information that the Ordnance Survey published about them. And one thing that puzzled me was that you have first order trig points, primaries, second order, third order, and fourth order. And I wondered what made a trig point a first order trig point. And I found out by reading that Ordnance Survey report I told you about, that it is in fact determined by the amount of computation done to correct the results. So basically, you do your readings over several days and maybe from several points. And then you put it through these enormous complicated conditioning equations to correct the errors. And back in those days, they were still done by people sitting at desks. They had, by then, desktop calculators, but they were pretty primitive. If you were lucky, had a really smart one in those days, it would do multiplication for you by doing addition over and over again. And they were electromechanical, so they'd bump and crank along. And so there was a limit to the amount of conditioning equations they could handle. So they laid down a network of about 300 primary trig points, conditioned the results really, really well, and then after that, did less and less work conditioning. And I've read this somewhere, I'm sure, but I couldn't tell you where, unfortunately. The resulting error is no worse than 5 centimeters. I believe that to be the case. And this is a quote from the Ordnance Survey report. Primary first order triangulation was designed broad network of triangles, average side length of 20 or 30 miles. Main chain extends from the south of England to central Scotland in 3 overlapping figures, never less than 50 miles wide, forms a strong framework from which the remaining figures, i.e. triangles, extend to cover the whole country. So a network of trig points known with very accurately known positions, and then a wider network across the whole country with less and less accuracy. And here is your traditional trig point. The sort of sandwich box thing, that's some more of my GPS equipment. This one is on Box Hill in Surrey. That's my nearest one. But there are various different kinds of trig points. So at Leith Hill Tower, for instance, one of the first trig points used in the first triangulation, still used in the re-triangulation in the 20th century. And in the middle of the floor, there's a brass bolt, and that's the reference point. This is a surface block. It's basically a block of concrete with some marks on it. And I think initially it sat on the surface, but over time sort of sunk. They tend to be about 3 inches below the surface these days, and they get lost. So the Ordnance Survey, when accurate GPS came along and technology like LiDAR, they lost interest in the trig points. They released the positions into the public domain and stopped maintaining them. A few have been adopted, usually by the landowners. I'm trying to get the National Trust, who own Box Hill, to adopt the Box Hill trig point. Nobody takes responsibility for the rest, and they're gradually deteriorating. They can be just completely covered in undergrowth. If you walk past this one on the main path, you will miss it because that undergrowth completely conceals it. This is somewhere around there is a surface block, or was, and it's either buried or it's gone altogether. But you know, who knows? And this is one on Effingham Common again, somewhere around there's a surface block, but I've yet to find it. And they're decaying. Bookham, for instance, town near me, was served by 3 surface blocks. They're all gone. They might just be buried, but they may have been dug up. And the Box Hill trig point has a large crack which lets in the frost and a big hole in one edge. So that's a picture I took in 2022. You can see an enormous lump out of one side, and this crack goes all the way round. So I reckon somebody who was sufficiently determined could actually topple the whole thing and send it down the hill, because it's on the side of a long hill. And that sort of thing appeals to some people. So the trig points are decaying. They were built to be very, very robust, but some of them are in worse state than others. I reckon this one has been hit with a mechanical digger at some point. But they will gradually deteriorate, like the statue of Ozymandias. And so they're industrial archaeology and they're disappearing. And this is how industrial archaeology is created. It starts off being high technology stuff that people need to do their work, and then they find other ways to do it, and they leave the stuff lying around in the landscape. So that's the end of my talk. Oh, and I've overrun by 2 minutes. So I'll stop talking now.
Right, so thank you very much. That's been a very interesting talk, and thank you very much for it. It's a very, very thorough run through of trig points. Really, it's thank you very much. So I'm just going to open up to the Q&A now. So if anyone has any questions, if you can put them in the chat, and we'll work our way through them. So yes, no, that was very thorough and very detailed, and again, it's thank you very much for the effort you've put into bringing all this together.
Thank
It's
you.
always good. It's all genuinely good to see someone having an interest in these in these areas. It's something always interesting. Just generally interesting to be aware of what's gone before. I think many of us are. I think many of us have an aware. Well, anyone that's been doing things at surveying has had an exposure to this throughout time. I remember quite a few point. I remember when I was doing my surveying at university. We were going through all the various processes, and yes, I still remember the various locations of a trig of. I still remember the leveling marks dotted around the building. It's yes, it's always a very interesting. So
It's
yes,
worth saying,
mhm.
I still use them because I'm trying to figure out whether the manufacturer's promises about the accurate GPS equipment that I've spent large amounts of money on is actually true. And one of the ways to do that is to go out to trig points, see what the device tells you the position is, and compare it with the OS records, which is why I'm interested in, well, how accurate were the OS records in the first place? How many trig pillars have I visited? Ooh,
That's a good question.
maybe no more than half a dozen, because I had some very specific aims. One was I went to Hurstmonceau Castle, which used to be the home of the Ordnance Survey, and they have one of their GPS base stations there. Basically, accurate GPS systems were a base station and a rover. So the base station was at Hurstmonceau Castle, and I took my rover to a trig point, which is up in the grounds, just maybe a quarter mile from the base station. And I wanted to see how accurate it was. And there were communication problems that day. So having driven all the way from Leatherhead, where I live, to Hurstmonceau, which is near the coast, it was a complete washout. But hey, it was a nice day. I've also been to the two. Sorry, I'm just reading the questions. I've also been to the two ends of the baseline and taken photographs of the cannon and attempted to measure their positions. I did quite well at that, so I found that the data matched quite well, so I was pleased about that. They're within range of another base station, which is at Imperial College. And I also, by the way, have a base station in my garden shed, like you do. Yeah. So, Jim Goldsmith
Yes, the next
asked,
question.
benchmark or trig pillar?
Yes,
I
so
think I
that's him.
understand
Yeah.
what that means.
So
But
what? So he's
basically, oh, yeah.
yeah. So he's actually put a link to a blog at the Ordnance Survey. So it's actually
Right.
going pretty quite a bit of it, and have a quick glance. It starts going into a bit of detail. So it's
Yeah, you might find that interesting, Simon. So that's why I pasted that blog in there for you.
So there are a small number of thousand trig points, and I believe each one is actually a benchmark. So that plate on the Box Hill trig pillar is actually its benchmark. So it tells you how high it is. And there are about 750,000 benchmarks. So they're scattered up and down every high street. In Leatherhead, there's one on the back wall of somebody's house. And they're all over the place. Although somebody told me about a benchmark that was on a gate post, and he was doing his survey, couldn't get any sense out of it, and then he discovered later that the gate post had been moved 20 years earlier, and the benchmark was either a mark cut on it or a metal plate, and it moved with it. Are the surface blocks marked on the OS data set? Ooh, I'm not quite sure. But the trig pointing website, which I put into the chat, gives you all of them, including the surface blocks. And what you need is an accurate GPS device, and it will take you to it. And you might have to take a trowel with you and dig away a bit of earth. But yeah, there is this hobby called trig pointing, which you may or may not know about, which is basically keen walkers make it their business to visit trig points. And on the trig pointing website, you can find reports of the state that the trig point is in, and useful information like how you get there and how to find it. And I thought this was completely mad until I found myself doing it. It's quite fun. And so, yeah, you can find a lot of, interesting. People are still producing benchmarks, even though there's accurate GPS equipment.
It's always interesting these little details and that you keep finding, and it's it's ask the sort of community, and you will get a lot of curious answers coming back at you. So it's so yeah, that's another. I think you're getting a lot of useful. I think you're getting a lot of useful information as well. That's as well as you providing the information to us. So it's been
over in Sussex, there are two very special trig points, which are very tall concrete pillars, like several meters tall, much taller than your standard trig point. And they were used to link the survey up to the telescope at Herstmonceux. So they form a line. The 3 points, the telescope and these two trig points, form a line. And that was used to link the results of the survey to latitude and longitude as measured from the telescope using stellar observations. Oh, one fun thing is if you've been to the Greenwich Observatory, there's a mark on the ground showing you the prime meridian. So this mark is supposed to run down the prime meridian. And according to GPS systems, it's out by a good 100 yards. And the reason, I believe, is because of variations in local gravity. So back in the 19th century, they assumed that gravity pointed to the center of the Earth, but it doesn't. And it doesn't because of the formation of the Earth. The Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago, when two planets collided. So the Earth and the Moon are the results of this collision, and the two planets were of slightly different density. So for that, and maybe for other reasons, there's huge lumps of matter inside the Earth of different density still moving around, and this causes differences in local gravity. So if you point your telescope vertically, according to a very, I think they used mercury mirrors to give you a horizontal. But of course, that assumes that gravity is pointing in the right direction. I believe it was that discrepancy that caused the calculation of the prime meridian to be in the wrong place. That's my understanding anyway. But you'd have to know a lot more about astronomy and other stuff than I do.
No, you start going to a lot of different fields there, trying to they all seem to come. They all tend to start coming together at some points, and this is one of these curious little confluences of these points. So it's but no, it's yeah. So okay, we'll just see. You've got another one coming here. Yeah. So part of my job is updating OS 25 K data. Sometimes I notice areas shifting ever so slightly through the though the OS has recalculated the map.
Is that's presumably not shifting due to continental drift, which is another one of my obsessions, because of course the whole country and the rest of bits of Europe is moving northeast at about 2.5 centimeters a year. And I think you mentioned this in the introduction you put out. I'm actually trying to get a school project off the ground where students at school, this is at secondary school, will go out and use accurate GPS equipment, which is now very cheap and very easy to use, as long as you understand how to use it, and actually go out and measure continental drift over several years. So basically, they go out with the GPS equipment 1 year, and maybe they just go into the school grounds and find the position of a point, and then they come back the next year and find the position of the same point, and if they use the right reference frame, they'll find it's moved. And of course, continental drift is a real nuisance for cartographers because you have to somehow compensate for it.
Yes, it's also this. Okay, and I've just got a lift clarification there. It's the no just parts of tiles, tiny areas. So it's another
Somebody in the
interesting one.
US.
Yes, and this. Yeah, so we've got a question from the US. Yes, it's so thanks so much. Very interesting and educational presentation. I went to look into trig points benchmarks here in the US. I wonder if they're still used. That's
well,
another interesting question.
Probably are used by some surveyors, but other surveyors will be using accurate GPS systems. Yeah, it all depends on what equipment you've got to hand.
Yes, it does, and I can see, and that's another link for you in the from Jim at the Ordnance Survey. He's put that OSNet Ordnance Survey, so that should be another interesting thing to add to your growing list of topics that
yes,
so that you can expand on.
Going to click on these links.
I'll make sure we get a copy to you so you've got
locator. No, I've got them now. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know the OS had published a benchmark locator. All right. Yeah. So my understanding from the OS report is that in places like the south of England, where it's fairly it's hilly, but it's we don't have mountains down here. They use spirit leveling to get from one benchmark to another. Once you get up north and you get mountains, then spirit leveling doesn't work anymore. You can't do spirit leveling up the side of a mountain. And they use the vertical ability of a theodolite, because the theodolites work in 3 dimensions.
Yes.
But what surprised me was it's better, apparently, to use spirit leveling when you can, which you would think would be a dreadfully error-prone process, because each time you do a hop, you increase the error. But apparently, spirit leveling is better if you can get away with it than measuring the height with a theodolite, which really surprised me.
It's an interesting process to use. You can, especially when you're trying to go at distance, that gets yes, you can a continued chain of measurements that you're always trying to avoid any errors creeping in. That's yes, that's an interesting and can be time-consuming task. It's a lot of very accurate record keeping for what can be very simple numbers, and and then you discover there's a flaw somewhere, and then you're going, did someone miswrite something on the way across, or was it just a natural error that's crept in? So no, it's an interesting process, and yes, anyone that goes into doing survey, anyone that does surveying, I think, well, at least they were about 18 years ago. They were all were basically being taught these older techniques to work our way through, work our way from point to point. So it's it's always it's always interesting when your background does involve doing a certain level of this as a, well, when you start doing some of this as a, well, as part of training, and then you go, and it's interesting seeing other people discover this other points coming from different angles. So it's no, it's been very interesting, and I think, and it's been a very thorough very thorough topic that you've gone through, and it's oh, and this never got another comment. That's why you yes, that's why you start and finish spirit leveling at a benchmark, so you can spread correct the errors.
Well, what surprised me was that the Ordnance Survey worked out the heights of the benchmarks in the first place using spirit leveling. And presumably you work your way down to Newlyn, and you find the relative difference in height between each benchmark, and then you work backwards up the chain, saying, oh, well, Newlyn's at this height, so mean sea level's here. Of course, mean sea level isn't mean sea level anymore, because sea level changes. Well, it changes all around the coast anyway. So you could just as easily say that the Ordnance Survey's notion of mean sea level is X meters below the summit of Ben Nevis. Because, of course, if you look at the OS record, you'll find that Ben Nevis is, I don't know, whatever it is, high. And yeah, so you can just work that in reverse. Well,
yes.
I was a bit frightened of doing this talk to a specialist audience of people who know far more about some of this stuff than I do. So I'm very pleased that it's gone as well as it has. And
no,
it is a complex subject which no one person, no one field understands, which is why I have the nerve to run courses in accurate GPS systems for surveyors, because there's stuff that I know about that they don't know about, because, as I said, they are IT systems, so that's where I come in. So,
yes.
Have any of your benchmarks been affected by ground movements? Yes. In Manchester, where I was brought up, one quite close to our house, there was a large coal mine, Agecroft Colliery, in the area, and one of the benchmarks is canted over at about a 20-degree angle, so it's completely useless due to mining subsidence. So you do get all sorts of problems.
No, interesting challenges in that one. So yes, no, I think that's been a very good talk, and thank you very much for giving it. It's been again, hopefully you've got some nice information from the community here as well, because there's been some, I think it's always, people are always happy to share some of the knowledge that they've got. So I just want to say thank you to Simon for the talk. I want to say thank you to our audience for joining us this week. And I want to welcome you back, anyone back to our next talk we'll be having in next month, and that's by Debbie Hall from the Bodleian Library, and she'll be speaking on adventures in maps. So I'd like to say to everyone, thank you again once again for joining us. But for today, I'd like to say thank you and goodbye.